You are listening to Middle East Monitor Conversations, bringing you lively discussions with prominent voices from the region and beyond, as we delve deeper into issues shaping the Middle East and North Africa, from politics, the culture, and the arts.
Hello, and welcome to MEMO Conversations. I'm Osman Butter, video producer of MEMO and Middle East Monitor. My guest today is Ross Caputi. Ross is a doctoral candidate in the Department of History at the University of Massachusetts-Amherst, and he is the Director of Archives at Archive Iraq. Ross's research and writing ranges from US foreign policy, with a focus on the Anglo-American invasion and occupation of Iraq, to the social history of Italian dialects. Quite a range there. He is also the main author of The Sacking of Fallujah, A People's History, published in 2019. Ross, welcome to MEMO Conversations.
Thanks for having me.
So you actually are a pretty, in a sense, a kind of unique person in this whole regard. I mean, you're a historian, right? And you're working on, matters to do with history, but you've also chosen to do history of not just the Middle East, but Iraq specifically. But before you sort of were a historian, you were also part of the US military. So I wonder if you could we could start with your background a little bit. Could you perhaps tell us a bit about your time in the US military and your experiences there?
Yeah, so I mean, my research definitely grows out of my personal experience. And also, once I got out of the military, I got pretty heavily involved in anti-war activism. And then Iraq was still a current event, a contemporary issue. So I approached it as activism, trying to raise awareness and advocate for our war victims and trying to build solidarity networks to, at the time, we were framing it as reparations for what we had done to Iraq. But, the United States has a relatively short memory. And after U.S. Framed it as withdrawing troops, there's a lot of complications with that narrative that they were telling when we withdrew in 2011. Nonetheless, Iraq fell out of the news media. It was no longer a current event. So I wanted to stay engaged. I didn't want to forget about Iraq like everyone else and just move on with my life. So I began to approach it more as a research topic. And now, I'm training to become a historian, and I'm approaching it as a memory project, trying to, I'd say create, because Americans remember very little about the war at all. So I'm trying to create a memory of the invasion and occupation that includes the Iraqi perspective and includes an understanding that much of our mission was not just illegal, but it did great harm to Iraqis. And I think it's really important that Americans understand it that way. But to circle back to my personal experience, I joined the Marine Corps in 2003. It was just after we invaded Iraq in March 2003. I went to boot camp in June, and I very much wanted to be part of the war. And I was worried that it was going to be over before I was even done with basic training. And, I had a lot of self-interested reasons for joining the military and wanting to be part of this war. I wanted to be a hero. I wanted everyone to think I was a tough guy, and I wanted to go off and have these adventures. And it's very easy for Americans to sort of think in a self-interested way about war, because we also have these assumptions that we always fight wars for good reasons. We are this sort of unique nation amongst nations that has this sort of global security mission. We go off to all these far-flung corners of the world and help people. That's what I grew up believing. And I never really bothered to interrogate these assumptions. It just was sort of there, never bothered to question it. So I didn't really see anything wrong at the time with having these other self-interested motives for joining this war. And even while we were training, I guess after basic training, I went to the 1st Battalion, 8th Marines, and we began this training workup, preparing to go to Iraq. So that was the spring of 2004. And at that point, the news was saying that we were facing an insurgency in Iraq. There are problems with framing it as an insurgency, but nonetheless, that was the assumption that we were dealing with at the time. And our training sort of reiterated these assumptions that we were coming to Iraq with a humanitarian mission. We were there to help people. And one of the sort of foundational assumptions of counterinsurgency training was that we could distinguish between civilians and insurgents. And we would do these like mock training scenarios where we'd go to some old housing facility and we'd run missions with actors playing Iraqis. And they always were sort of typecast into 2 roles. There were the good Iraqis, the civilians, and the bad Iraqis, who were the insurgent terrorists, and the distinction between the two didn't really matter at all. They were just sort of merged as a single menacing figure. So I went to Iraq wanting to be this hero, and then I got there, and the limited interaction I had with Iraqis made it immediately clear that this distinction between civilians and terrorists was just a gross oversimplification of what Iraqis actually thought and felt. It was way more complicated than I had assumed it to be. And I don't think I really understood at the time exactly how harmful our mission was to Iraqis, but I did see that there was a lot of gray area, and I just wasn't prepared to be operating within that gray area. I wanted to be a hero. I didn't want to be anything other than that. So I very quickly soured on the mission, just became really disillusioned. And even more so by the time my unit got called into the second siege of Fallujah. We were calling it a battle at the time, but I think it's more appropriate to call it a siege. It was siege warfare, and nobody spoke of it like that at the time, but it was without a doubt siege warfare. But in Fallujah, I was acting as a radio operator at the time. That was the company commander's radio operator for 1st Battalion, 8th Marines. They told us this should have been an operation that I should have been very excited about, because they framed it as a rescue mission. This was an opportunity for all of us to be that hero that we all signed up to be. They said Al-Qaeda terrorists led by this figure, Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, had taken control of the city, somehow was holding the entire civilian population hostage, and we were going to come in and rescue the city. They told us all the civilians had left, and the only people left in the city were terrorists. They said about 2,000 terrorists. So on November 8th, they inserted us with a number of other battalions into Fallujah, and we went house to house for about a week straight. And we started taking casualties right away, and it was pretty bad. A lot of guys were getting hurt, and as guys were getting hurt and getting killed and getting evacuated from the battlefield, we took fewer and fewer precautions to safeguard civilian life. We did see a few civilians while we were in there. There was most likely probably about 50,000 civilians still in the city, possibly more. We assumed less. They told us going into it that we didn't need to prepare for civilians at all. But once we got there, we saw that there was a few. Nonetheless, we proceeded using tactics that put our safety before theirs. For example, reconnaissance by fire. So entering into a house, we would shoot first, just like spray the house down with like a machine gun of some sort, or like throw frag grenades into a room first before you enter in there, to make sure that no one's inside. If you do that first and you hear something, you know somebody's in the house, we wouldn't even bother sending guys in to clear the house. We'd just either call up a tank, fire the main gun into it, flatten the house, bulldoze it. We had bulldozers with us. As the battle progressed, we were being more and more sort of reckless in the tactics that we were using. And I'm sure it put a lot of civilians in harm's way. I think mostly probably the biggest thing that put civilians in danger was the bombing campaign leading up to our ground invasion. I'm only aware of one estimate of civilian casualties done by a reconstruction committee after the battle, and they estimated between 4,000 and 6,000 civilian dead. I have to suspect that it was the bombing campaign that explains that level of civilian casualties. I was unaware of this 4,000 to 6,000 civilian dead figure until years after, when I started to research the operations in Fallujah. But nonetheless, I was really staggered by the level of destruction. I mean, towards the end of it, we were just bulldozing entire neighborhoods. And I started to think, you know, if I was a person from Fallujah, I might be one of these rebel fighters, because I wouldn't be okay with this happening in my country. The idea that we were rescuing this city as we were flattening it, it seemed so illogical to me. And I thought this very like narrow story that my command had given us, it had to be an oversimplification, like everything else that they had told us up until that point. There had to be more to it. So I started to have a lot of suspicions. I was feeling really conflicted, but also I just didn't have the confidence to say, hey, this is wrong. Hey, I don't believe in what we're doing. That didn't come till later, when I started to do a lot of reading. Unfortunately, far too late.
So yeah. I didn't want to interrupt you. So I was just going to say, so because obviously you go from a point where you're obviously starting to have doubts, it sounds like, during the siege, but when does those doubts turn into sort of full on being against the war itself?
It took a lot of reading. When we got back from Iraq, so January 2005, we had a few months there where we weren't doing a lot, sort of some light training. Typically that's the case. They let you rest a little bit before they send you on another deployment. So I had some time to read. I read a few things. I started to understand for the first time, one of the first things I read, it came about in an odd way, because my friend was reading Che Guevara's biography in the barracks, because he thought, you know, there was some continuity between, you know, Latin American guerrillas and, you know, insurgents in Iraq. I had seen this picture, this famous iconic picture of Che Guevara before. I didn't really know what it was about, nonetheless I read it because I had nothing to do. And honestly, it was the first time in my life I understood the concept of imperialism. I mean, the way we learn about it in American schools, you learn about British imperialism and then, you know, the American revolutionary struggle. You never learn about American imperialism. And it was the first time I made that connection with Iraq and started to think, we don't even have a right to be here. What are we doing in someone else's country? So that was a light bulb that went on in my head. Not that, like, you know, I didn't understand Leninist Marxism. I didn't really understand Che's ideology, but nonetheless, this idea of imperialism was sort of a big wake-up call for me. And then I started to read more about Iraq. I found independent journalists, and I began to understand the distinction between these embedded journalists that we had with us. We had BBC guys in our unit, and these independent journalists who were able to capture the Iraqi side of the story. And that was another big wake-up call for me. So reading people like Dar Jamail, Nir Rosen, guys who like went into Iraqi communities and captured what they thought and felt about our mission in their country. And it made sense. We were really bringing a tremendous amount of hardship into their lives, and a lot of innocent people were getting hurt and getting killed, and they were very angry about what we were doing in their country. I got it. There was a few moments during our deployment where I could see, like, we created big problems for these tiny communities along the Euphrates River in the area where we were operating. And I would have been angry too. I might have wanted to fight back if I was in their situation. So it slowly came together as I read more and over the years got more involved with different anti-war groups, solidarity groups. I got to meet more Iraqis and hear from them firsthand, what their experience was like, what they felt about it. And it took time.
Yeah, because I can imagine, I don't know what the reaction from your, colleagues in those military units would have been like, but I assume none of them went down the journey that you did, or at least to the extent you did.
No, I think I'm really lucky for a lot of reasons. So as an RTO, I wasn't the guy kicking down doors in Fallujah. So I don't think I came out of it with the debilitating PTSD that a lot of guys in my unit did. Also, when we came back from Iraq, people started to abuse alcohol and different substances heavily within a couple of months of being back from Iraq. It was clear that people were struggling with the experience. I never had those kinds of problems, and within about a year, half of our unit got kicked out of the Marine Corps for failing drug tests. So they had to go back home, didn't get any benefits. And Fallujah for them is kind of that one shining moment in their life where they were part of something really special. And I think, because of their trauma, because of, their experience with getting kicked out of the Marine Corps and things like that, a lot of guys really clung to the narrative that our commanders told them, that, this was a liberation mission. We were saving Fallujah from these terrorists. This was the battle that broke the back of the Iraqi insurgency and made Iraq's first democratic election possible. And as I more and more spoke out against our mission, they felt like I was taking something away from them. So I think Fallujah veterans in particular are really resistant to challenging that narrative.
Yes, and challenging it you have been doing. It's not just, a lot of people who served in the military at some point during Iraq. There are a few people who did come out against the war afterwards, but you did something else. You went to try and not just understand the Iraqi perspective. It wasn't like, well, I can kind of understand why they wouldn't want us here and just leave it at that. You actually went further than that. You wanted to really not just understand the Iraqi perspectives out there, because obviously it's plural, but you wanted to document them as well and build an oral archive. So talk to us a bit about, the significance of building an oral archive of Iraqi experiences.
So something I came across in my research that really blew my mind, because I had no idea this was going on. I was just a low-level private, a radio operator. I had no idea of these higher level military considerations that were going on. And there was this really robust propaganda apparatus during the war. The military calls it information operations. One of the goals of information operations was perception management, to manage the public's perception of military operations in Iraq. And it went much deeper than just sort of, dressing up military actions in pretty language after the fact. It actually came from this major shift in strategic thinking about the role of soft power in military operations. And there was this sort of transformation from, military actions happening on a battlefield to happening in a battle space. And it was no longer enough to just sort of be militarily dominant and to dominate the enemy. There was also this idea that they needed to achieve information dominance. And information operations, it deceived the American public on like the most fundamental assumptions about, what the war was about, who we were fighting, what we were trying to do. The level of deception really just blew my mind. And Fallujah is kind of a perfect example, because we ended up getting sucked into the first operation, the first siege of Fallujah in the spring of 2004, because 4 American mercenaries got killed as they were trying to travel through Fallujah. Americans didn't really understand why Americans were being targeted in this way, because they didn't understand what the occupation meant for Iraqis and how many innocent people were being killed in the course of the operation. They couldn't relate to the anger that people felt in Fallujah and why it was directed towards these 4 mercenaries in such a violent way. So there was all this public commotion calling for the first siege of Fallujah, and we lost. We sent 2 battalions into Fallujah, met very tough military resistance, but mostly because there was an Al Jazeera broadcast crew in the city, and they captured on camera that we couldn't defeat these militias in Fallujah without destroying residential neighborhoods and killing hundreds of civilians. All that was captured on camera and created all this political pressure to withdraw. We negotiated a retreat out of the city. It was a very embarrassing affair. So then the US, the lesson they took from this is kind of crazy. Not that like we shouldn't conduct combat operations in residential neighborhoods. No, we just need to make sure it's not caught on camera. So they started this information campaign, one, to re-characterize these people we were fighting against, the insurgents, and they began to frame them not as former Baathists or criminals, old regime elements, but as Islamic extremists associated with Al-Qaeda in Iraq, led by this guy, Abu Musab al-Zarqawi. This was a psychological operation that they were running in 2004 to mislead the American public and to create an excuse for going back into Fallujah. There is zero evidence that Abu Musab al-Zarqawi ever set foot in Fallujah. If you talk to anybody from Fallujah, nobody's ever seen the guy. There is no evidence. There's not a photo. There's nothing. But they said he was in Fallujah, building his army and using it as a base to launch attacks all across Iraq. So here's an example of propaganda, not just dressing up U.S. military actions in fancy rhetoric. We actually created it set military objectives. We would not have gone into Fallujah the second time if it wasn't for this lie about Abu Musab al-Zarqawi. So just the level of deception blew my mind. That was 4,000 to 6,000 civilian deaths that shouldn't have happened. It happened because of a lie. There was dozens of U.S. military deaths in the course of the second operation. 2 friends from my unit died because of these lies. So it drove home to me the importance of having access to this information. So these projects that I'm involved with now, we're beginning with the assumption that we have a right to know. We are living in a battle space. So I think we need to really think about what that means in terms of democratic citizenship. So, we have a right to this information, and these projects are, the main goal is to gather as much documentation as possible, make it available to the public. And this way we can begin to have an evidence-based conversation about what we did to Iraq. And it's a conversation that hasn't happened yet. It needs to happen. But first, we need access to this information.
Yes. And as I've just sort of mentioned as well, as we're discussing, you went on to work on oral history from Fallujah, but you're also now involved in building an Iraqi archive, right? So I'm wondering then, you've now gone and done a lot of interviews, you've helped others put this stuff together, you're working with a lot of other people. What kind of stories are Iraqis telling?
So I guess one thing that really became clear to me in the course of trying to gather Iraqi stories and to make them available to Americans, to translate them, to transcribe them, is the importance of perspective. And this is, perspective there was a lot of strategic thinking about the importance of perspective in these information operations. And that was the whole reason for the embedded journalism project, which was run by information operations. So they would embed these journalists into military units in order to tell a story from the perspective of frontline soldiers. That was their notion of a ground truth, right? Because the American public, we have this I don't know, deep respect, almost sort of reverence for veterans in our society. Americans really trust their soldiers, and they think, you know, the war through their eyes is the most trustworthy way of focusing the narrative, right? But what this does is it relegates Iraqis to the background, right? Their story is never told through the control of the perspective, through the information operations, right? So when Iraqis tell this story, what really stands out as being very different to me is the notion of sovereignty. And Americans, we're kind of very skeptical about this notion of sovereignty. We tend to think that our own exceptionalism overrides the sovereignty of every other nation in the world. And when I was in Iraq, we never even considered, like, do we even have a right to be here? Like, should we just be changing all these things in other people's country, changing their constitution, changing their laws? It's something that doesn't even occur to us. But from Iraqis, from the very beginning, everything about our mission in their country was a violation of their sovereignty. And the rebel fighters that we were fighting against, we believed that they were driven by some sort of like these religious ideas or this fanatical anti-Americanism. Like, there was nothing rational about it. But no, they were driven by this notion of sovereignty. They didn't want foreign troops in their country. They didn't want a foreign government running their government. It was all about sovereignty for them. So that's a really central notion. And that's why we really want this Archive Iraq project to be a transnational historical project, a transnational archive. We have to include the Iraqi story as much as the American story. We think that that's really important. Another thing is just the scale of Iraqi suffering. It's hard to wrap your mind around. I mean, you know, just heartbreaking stories about people watching their family members get gunned down in the street because they reached into their pocket and they had something in their hand. Maybe it was a phone, and some Marine sitting on a roof somewhere just didn't know what it was. And, you know, to prioritize their own safety, shot first. Or, you know, maybe they went out after curfew because they needed something essential like water or medicine. And if there were a lot of times there was like if there are people on the street after curfew, it was I forget what you call it in military lingo, but nonetheless, it was sort of like a policy. If there's anyone on the street, just shoot.
Shoot first.
And then there's a lot of people who just died for more mundane reasons, but caused by the occupation, like just the very basic medicines weren't available because the level of the violence in the country. There was constant power shortages. So if anybody was on like a breathing tube in a hospital and the power went out, they died. There have been studies to estimate the excess deaths caused by the occupation, not just direct violence, but like indirect causes, like, you know, the availability of medicine or, you know, utilities and things of that sort. And it's most likely as high as 1.5 million. Some other estimates have put it at 1 million. The level of suffering is really just astonishing. And Americans have no awareness of how bad we made it for Iraqis.
It is an odd thing to think about, because when you think about it, the Iraq War was a formative moment, you know, in American history. And it's almost like, if I'm looking at the US, it's almost like nothing happened, right? Maybe some people are like, oh, I don't really understand what happened. Yeah, I don't really like what we went in, but, you know, it doesn't really affect me. Whereas in Iraq, there's this sort of imbalance between experiences. There's like Iraqis have no choice, no matter what they do, but to remember what happened to them. And the US has, you know, they don't need to do that. There's an imbalance there.
Yeah, it's really strange. I have a hard time wrapping my head around the culture here. And as a veteran, I feel pressure to move on with my life. I think people think that I'm obsessed with Iraq because I want to stay, engaged. I feel a moral responsibility to do this work. I don't want to move on. I don't want to forget about Iraq. And I think people think that that's strange. Everybody else, it's in the past. They move on. There's no sense of responsibility for what we did to Iraq.
Maybe you need someone like a Ken Burns to do a 10-part documentary like he did with Vietnam.
But even still, do Americans feel a sense of responsibility for what we did to Vietnam? There's undoubtedly a better memory, or a more complete, more coherent memory of Vietnam compared to Iraq. I think, all people remember about Iraq, a couple place names, Fallujah, Sadr City, a few buzzwords, the surge, counterinsurgency. Apart from that, what do Americans remember about Iraq? Very little.
What do you think that is? I mean, because my sort of impression was, because from watching the Ken Burns documentary on Vietnam, it seems that up until about 66, 67, the general US population, there was debates about Vietnam, but it wasn't a main feature for most people. They didn't think much about it. It was only when they started talking about drafting in more troops, which would have meant people from, say, middle class or college students going in, you suddenly saw a big surge in memory and activism around that. Is that something similar with Iraq, where because we didn't really have, say, a draft or anything, it's just not a formative part of the experience in the US?
Yeah, I think that's part of it, having an all-volunteer military. I think also our society is probably more tribalized, compartmentalized, alienated. So, I mean, you can live your life in your little information bubble and only look at what you want to look at. You don't, there was a national level conversation during the Vietnam War, more properly the invasion of Vietnam. And nothing like that really existed during the years of the occupation in Iraq. I mean, you could tune into the news if you wanted, or you could tune it out. Whereas I feel like during the Vietnam era, there was a large anti-war movement. It was part of this broader cultural movement. It was much more part of society that you couldn't just, look away from. Whereas Iraq, we have the privilege now to just tune it out.
Yeah, and I think it's also perhaps part of that is mainly partially explained by the fact that you did have 9/11 a few years before it. And so, unlike with Vietnam, where there was no obvious attack on American soil, which you could sort of sully the memory with, I think maybe that may play a role as well.
Yeah, I suspect so.
And so what do you think is going to be, I mean, I was looking at, for I think a few months ago, I was looking at, because when the US went into Iraq, and because you're talking about archive, they actually took a lot of Iraq's archives back to the US with them. So the Ba'ath Party's Interior Ministry, I think, their entire archive was taken back to the US, and you used to be able to access it, but I think they've now shut down, which, you've taken it and now you don't give it to the public. What do you see as sort of the future of the memory of Iraq in that way?
Yeah, I recently read a great article about those documents by a scholar named Michael Brill, and I think there was actually a lot of legitimate security concerns around those documents. They were eventually pressured to return some of them, and I think the documents were used for sectarian reprisal within Iraq. But our project is really facing two challenges. The documents that are most available to us are mostly American military documents that tell a very particular kind of story. In order to tell a more balanced story, we need greater access to Iraqi documents, Iraqi newspapers. We need to conduct more oral histories. But because of the violence during the occupation, just a lot of documentation was just destroyed, or just like things weren't being documented, or it's just now there's this atmosphere of fear within Iraq, and people are, for very good reasons, are afraid to talk. So it's difficult to conduct oral histories. Documenting the Iraqi experience is really difficult for a lot of practical security reasons. So I think it's going to take time. We have to continue to try to push the issue, but really take seriously people's security concerns. And it's by all means, we don't want to put anybody in danger or put them in a situation where they become a target because they're telling their story. So it's delicate, and it's delicate, and it's going to take time.
So talk to me though a little bit about this archive that you're building. I mean, obviously you've just mentioned some of the issues, but so you're conducting these oral histories, talking to people, the ones you can. What did you do with them once you've done the sort of interview? Do you record them? Do you put them online? How is this working? How will this work?
So the idea is it's going to be an open access digital archive. Everything will be free and available to the public. And when people are willing, we like to video record the oral histories. And I think it's important to let people choose the language that they tell their story in. So some of these are going to be conducted in Arabic, others might be conducted in English, and they're going to be translated into both languages. I've learned a ton by listening to Iraqis tell their story in Arabic, because the vocabulary that they use is so fundamentally different from the way the story gets told in English. So even up until a couple of years ago, I had this assumption in my head of the 2006 to 2007 period as a civil war. But Iraqis don't speak of it as a civil war. They speak of it as the militia war, because it was really being driven by the militias that we were training and funding and arming out of the Ministry of Interior. So I think that sort of reframing is really important for telling this transnational history that we want to tell. But doing this work, it's very labor intensive. It's expensive. Translating these oral histories is expensive. So we want to get the public involved in this project. Obviously, we need the financial support, but we also want people to be engaged with this whole truth-telling process that we're engaged in. We like the video interviews because they're great for social media. That's a great way to get people engaged with this. We want to create resources for classrooms so that high school teachers, college teachers can bring these materials into the classroom and teach this history. There's no textbook on this period of history, the invasion and occupation, the Iraq War, whatever you want to call it. There doesn't exist yet any materials for people to be teaching this in the classroom. So we want to create that kind of stuff. We want to create easily shareable materials for social media, for that form of engagement, podcasts. So it's very much a public history project, a public education project. And yeah.
Okay, and where are you storing all this stuff? Like physically, where is it being stored?
Well, we have a preservation plan. We use a combination of local hard drives as well as a cloud drive. We triplicate everything. We make sure everything is backed up and preserved for forever, if possible.
Okay, and so what else? So looking forward to the future, what else are you working on? What are you going to be doing?
Well, this is an enormous project, and this will keep us busy for a decade, if not decades. There's a tremendous amount of work to do. Just in terms of, continuing to build up the website, to build the archive itself, build our collections, but also to improve the functionality of the website. I would admit right now the website's a little basic, but I think over the next couple of years, I plan on creating more digital exhibits. And I think rather than a traditional archive where people can search collections by metadata and title and stuff like that, we really want people to navigate these materials through these engaging digital exhibits. We want it to be really beautiful and to be very narrative based. So people will, go through these exhibits, read about the history and also come into contact with different primary sources, whether oral histories, documents, whatever. For me also, my dissertation is going to be creating one of these digital exhibits, and I have other writing projects I'm working on, memoirs in the works. Yeah.
Ross Caputi, thank you for talking to us at Memo Conversation.
Thanks for having me.
And to our audience, thank you for tuning in. Please do tune in next time for more Memo Conversations.
This was Middle East Monitor Conversations, brought to you by the Middle East Monitor in London.